On this edition of Independent Sources, Mubarak no more. Will the youth movement that sparked a revolution in Egypt be a part of the new leadership in that country?
Southern Sudan rising. Concerns stir as a new country rises in Africa.
And journalists under fire in Venezuela. Welcome to Independent Sources. I'm Gary Pierre-Pierre.
And I'm Viano Ravinka. Tahrir Square, or Revolution Square, has lived up to its name over the last few weeks. The area was the staging ground for what is being called one of the biggest uprisings in Egyptian history.
With President Hosni Mubarak gone and an interim military government promising that it will give way to a democratically elected leadership within the next 6 months, where does the youth movement that sparked this revolution fit into the country's future?
I spoke with Khaled Dawoud, who has been covering the story over the last few weeks, about the current situation in Egypt and the search for new leadership. Khaled, give us a sense of how things are now getting back to normality.
Well, Leonora, I can tell you first of all that Egyptians are still celebrating until now, almost 3 days after the resignation of former Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak and achieving a very remarkable achievement which has never been witnessed in Egypt before. I can feel a sense of happiness and pride among the hundreds of thousands of Egyptians who have been flooding to Tahrir Square since late Friday when Mubarak announced his resignation. But of course, at the same time, things are not totally back to order. As a matter of fact, maybe right now we are witnessing a new stage in this ongoing revolution whereby almost every sector of Egyptians is out in the streets protesting their conditions over the past 20 or 30 years. We've seen workers in banks on strikes on Monday. Trade unions also announcing several strikes because they want an improvement in their living conditions, raise in pay. As an Egyptian journalist myself, we've been witnessing a lot of sort of mini revolts in government-owned newspapers whereby journalists right now want to remove the editors who are known for their loyalty and defense of the former Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak. So on one hand, there's a lot of happiness and pride. At the same time, there's a lot of movement and demands and requests, and there are a lot of high expectations.
Going back to the protests in Tahrir Square a few days ago, you were taken by some pro-Mubarak people. How did that happen, and why have they closed in on you, you think?
Part of this plan by the former regime was to prevent people from reaching Tahrir Square, where people, or young people of all walks of life, have been basically organizing a sit-down since the revolt started on January 25th. When I was trying to reach the square, I was stopped by some of people who described themselves as Mubarak supporters. They were shouting slogans pro-President Mubarak and refusing that he should resign right away as the people were protesting. And although I showed them my ID, my press ID, they continued to insist that I look like one of the demonstrators in their opinion. And at the same time, there was another young lady, about 23-year-old, who also was trying to reach the Tahrir Square. And these young people with secret police who were clearly seen at the place were also basically harassing this young woman, beating her up, pulling her hair. So I tried to interfere, but at the end of the day, they basically started beating both of us. And they put us in a cab. They forced us into a cab. And this cab drove us to one army location where there were basically a few hundred people kept inside under the control of the army. And I was kept with this young lady for about 3 hours until I managed to speak to the senior officer in that location, explain to him that I'm a journalist and that I even lived in the same neighborhood where I was arrested or basically kidnapped by those thugs. And luckily enough, he was convinced, and he let me go with that young girl. But that really was very minor compared to what other young people countered in the square on Wednesday, when the government even reached the former regime or Mubarak supporters reached the stage of basically coming on top of horses and camels and carrying knives and swords and trying to kick the people out of Tahrir Square. Fortunately enough, the young people who were in that square defended themselves. There was a battle, and it was a very sad battle, because one thing we did not want to see at all was Egyptians fighting amongst each other. But in those battles, many young people died. I witnessed personally young people basically passing away, at least 2 or 3 in front of my own eyes, and I carried so many injured people on that day. It was a very sad day, but people insisted, and the more the regime used brutality and violence against the people in Tahrir Square, strangely enough, the demonstrations got bigger and bigger and bigger by the day. And the more Mubarak regime gives compromises, the people continue to insist on their main request that Mubarak had to go after 30 years, after attempts to basically hand over the country to his son. And at the end of the day, it was the will of the people, and the will of the people succeeded. And the army, basically, I think, was convinced that there was no other option except to remove former President Mubarak, because he became the source of instability rather than the protests that were taking place in Tahrir Square.
Talking about the army, are there any doubts amongst people that the army will cede power within 6 months or so, as it said?
I think so far the hopes remain positive, because the army, and unlike the police force, has totally refused to get into any confrontation with the protesters since those protests started on January 25th. During 11 days I spent in Tahrir Square, those army soldiers were under a lot of pressure, but they never basically lifted a gun against one of the protesters. And at the end of the day, many people here are convinced that it wasn't the interference of the army which broke this stubborn behavior of the former president and forced him to resign. Plus, Leonora, I mean, the people who revolted, the millions who came out in Cairo, the capital, and many other Egyptian cities that I don't want people in the outside world to forget about. It was not only Cairo, it was Alexandria, it was Suez, it was Luxor, Aswan. Everywhere there were protesters asking for Mubarak's removal and the establishment of a civilian government, a democratic regime, a government that respects the rights of its people, a government that's accountable, a president that we can change once every 10 or 12 years, whatever the people agree on. So with all those expectations, I think the army that did not want to go into the confrontation with the people would not, frustrate the hope of the Egyptians and refuse to give up power in 6 months. There's a lot of pressure, and I don't think that Egypt's army would get into this business of confronting the majority of the Egyptian people.
How confident are you that the young people, as represented in the streets of Cairo and the other cities that you mentioned, are going to participate in the democratic election that's next?
Well, I mean, those people who led the revolution definitely would like to protect that revolution, and I've already been reading and seeing attempts by those young people to form political parties, to represent them, running maybe after one candidate or the other. But I want to tell you that, this experience that I've had, like many Egyptians, the hope that those people created in us also makes many Egyptians hopeful that the future would be much better. I mean, one day after Mubarak was toppled, after the revolution succeeded, the same young people who were protesting, who were ready to sacrifice their souls for the success of this revolution, started cleaning up the Tahrir Square. The Tahrir Square witnessed some cleaning that it's never seen in its history, in my opinion. I mean, young women, young men, old women, they were all carrying, sweepers, and they were carrying, everything to clean those streets and to show that what they wanted was a new democratic Egypt in which they would love to live in. And that's why, I hope I'm not too optimistic, but I hope that this spirit that I saw in Tahrir Square after the success of the revolution, the presence of all of Egypt there, and the model that they gave, people really cared about each other. I saw the Muslims and Christians there. We had a lot of sectarian problems even by the beginning of this year, where we saw the bombing of a church in Alexandria, but suddenly people forgot about all those bad memories and bad feelings that lasted for many years, and they all now have the feeling that they want to participate in a new Egypt. And that's why I'm confident in those young people who led the revolution and who surprised all of us. All of us. I mean, I'm 44 years old. When I was a student in university at the age of those young people, I never dreamt of having a demonstration more than 200, 300 people. Those guys managed to mobilize millions of Egyptians and to do things we've never dreamt of before. So that's why I think they will keep it up and continue to take care of their country.
I've talked to you when you were on the show about the Muslim Brotherhood, and I have to say that the mainstream media here is still bringing up whether or not the Muslim Brotherhood has a chance in taking over. What's going on in Egypt, and what's really the likelihood of that happening?
Well, concerning the taking over part, I think this is really very far from happening, because even the Muslim Brotherhood group itself, have announced officially that they're not going to nominate a candidate for the presidency because they recognize that the world maybe will not be willing and ready to see a government that's led by Muslim Brotherhood, who still themselves have not developed their own views on democracy and the importance of having a civilian state. But the issue is right now, many Egyptian political parties are taking part in discussions over a new constitution. This constitution is going to be very important in determining that we're going to have a democratic country whereby we have clean and fair elections, in which the Muslim Brotherhood, of course, will have to participate because they are one of the biggest political groups in the country. But by all estimates, not just like, a reporter like myself, experts and analysts who know more about the subjects, even if we had the best clean elections, the Muslim Brotherhood most likely will not get more than 25 or 35% of the vote. And at the end of the day, I think the people who again led this revolution would want to have an Egypt that will continue to respect its neighbors, respect the treaties that it signed. And again, I want to confirm to you, over the 12 days that I've spent in Tahrir Square, I did not hear any anti-US slogans. I did not hear anti-Israel slogans. I'm not saying that the people in the square did not have strong views about Israel and the occupation of Palestine, but our issue was cleaning up Egypt. Egypt coming first and establishing it as a democratic country. And I'm sure that after having a reasonable democracy where people rule themselves, they will know very well where their interests lie. And our interests definitely do not lie in having a state run by religious figures who do not respect basic rights, women's rights or human rights, freedom of expression and such issues.
We will have to close it here, but not before I thank you for a note that you've sent me, one of the most memorable emails that I've ever received, in which you told me to tell my daughter when she grows up about the story of the Egyptian people. You said the story of Egypt's brave people, and I'm sure your son is very proud of you for participating and being a witness of these historical protests. Thank you, Khaled Dawoud, via telephone from Cairo.
Thank you very much, Leonora.
Still to come on Independent Sources. Independence for Southern Sudan, but not without a few growing pains.
Before that, Abby Shola has some other news.
Thanks, Leonora. Here's a look at some headlines from the ethnic media. From the Filipino Reporter, the Filipino government is taking steps to crack down on human trafficking. Philippine Vice President Jejomar Binay recently told the Filipino-American press that his government is working closely with the U.S. Department of State, Department of Justice, and Department of Labor on a campaign against human trafficking from the Philippines. The U.S. Department of State says the Philippines is a source, destination, and transit country for men, women, and children who are subjected to forced prostitution and labor. A new study finds that minorities didn't cause the housing crisis, as some conservative Republicans suggest. America's Wire reports that many conservatives blame the housing crisis on affordable housing programs and the Community Reinvestment Act, CRA. The law requires bank examiners to investigate the number of loans made in urban neighborhoods. But the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, a group established by Congress, found that CRA and affordable housing initiatives were not a significant factor in subprime lending or the housing crisis. Cuban scholar Humberto Lopez Morales predicts that by 2050, 10% of the world's population will speak Spanish, with the United States being the biggest Spanish-speaking country. To support this theory, Lopez cited a study that says 2.5 Hispanics enter the United States every minute, seeking better living conditions, education, and decent wages. That from El País. And finally, a romantic serenade may seem outdated, but the expression of love through song is still embraced in small Italian villages. The Italian Tribune reports that to this day, love-struck men in rural towns in Italy use serenades to woo young maidens. The history of the serenade is vague, but some evidence suggests that the practice originated in Italy. Those are just a few headlines from the ethnic media. Back to Gary and Vianora in the studio.
Thanks, Abby. While the world had its eyes on Egypt, there was an equally historic moment unfolding just south of that country in the Sudan. The Southern Sudan was voting overwhelmingly for the right to secede from the rest of the country.
The referendum was part of a peace accord signed in 2005 that ended a bloody civil war in the country. Long seen as the backwater brother of the North, Southern Sudan is still going through growing pains. Crime has reportedly gone up, and there are concerns that squabbles over land in the capital will increase.
I sat down with the UN correspondent for the Inter-Press Service, Kanya D'Almeida, to talk about the South's secession and some of the concerns clouding the historical event. Kanya, just recently, Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir accepted the secession vote. So what's the next challenge for Southern Sudan?
Well, I mean, the question of Bashir accepting the outcome of the referendum, I think, has to do with the fact that he's essentially propped up by money that's coming in from the oil giants and the arms dealers. So the challenge, I think, is less a question of whether, you know, what the referendum said as much as it is to do with the root causes of the conflict. And to talk about that, it depends on who you talk to. You'll get a different answer. You know, I mean, at the UN, people are mostly interested in talking about the successive governments since Meir to al-Bashir. But really, there are a lot of analysts who've been talking about the fact that the root causes go much deeper. Douglas Johnson, for example, has...
Well, let's talk about the deeper problems. What are they? What has been going on between the North and the South in Sudan?
Well, I mean, if you look at what's been happening in Sudan since independence in '56, it's been really a question of neoliberal development practices which have, through the state and through industrialized farming, absorbed such vast tracts of land that, I mean, Sudan has a population that's 20% nomadic. And you have these two groups, the Dinka and the Miseria, who have been incredibly displaced from their lands. They've been losing their grazing pastures, they've been losing their water resources. So it's really been more like a turf war between nomadic groups as a result of development policies, which has been exacerbated by Khartoum, which has successively throughout its different regimes backed the sort of Arab Islamic Miseria, who are seasonal grazers, against the Dinka, who have had their lands incredibly annexed and removed. So I think it's more a question of indigenous struggles, I think, rather than anything to do with North and South per se. It's a very moving, roving problem in Sudan.
Well, one of the situations is that the South will essentially be a landlocked country. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the resources from the North, oil and water resources. Now, is this something that's going to be negotiated between the two sides, or what happens? How does the South ensure itself that it has resources necessary to function as a republic?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, just last week, the oil minister for Southern Sudan made very clear in an interview with AFP that he is going to, well, the Southern government is going to honor every contract made with the CNPC, the Chinese National Petroleum Corporation, that was made even before the 2005 Comprehensive Peace Agreement. And when you're looking at a region that has 98% of its government income coming in through the CNPC-sponsored oil production, I mean, it's just incredibly dependent on an outside force. So independence is kind of a strange word to use here. I mean, I'm not sure how much the new Sudanese government will be able to determine the use of their own resources outside of what China wants. And we've sort of seen what China's priorities are here.
I mean, building a nation is really difficult, arduous task. Where does Southern Sudan begin?
I think the root causes of the conflict really have to be looked at here. And in that case, the Abyei Boundary Committee or Commission had laid out a pretty solid policy for what to do. I mean, now that wasn't accepted by Khartoum. It then went to the PCA at The Hague, which ruled in 2009 about the boundaries of what Abyei would be and who would get to vote in a separate referendum. It should really be a separate referendum. But that hasn't been accepted either by Khartoum. And as long as the Dinko people are going to be marginalized in the governmental and the localized government systems, and as long as these lands are going to continue to be annexed, then you're not dealing with the root causes of the problem. Another thing that really needs to be dealt with is what's going to happen with the oil reserves. Since the CPA in 2005, there hasn't been a comprehensive discussion of what's going to happen with the pipelines. The pipeline that leads from the south to the north in Port Sudan hasn't been discussed, but how payment for that will be made, how revenues for that will be split. The environmental havoc that's been wreaked by China hasn't been dealt with at all. That's going to be a huge issue. I mean, you have these lakes of toxic waste that have actually reduced the grazing land even more. I mean,
China has had a real controversial, I guess, tenure in African development and investment. What role is China playing here besides just the oil sector?
Well, I mean, analysts and the media have been having a field day with China's responses, especially in the last month. They've been calling it I believe a charming offensive on the Southern Sudanese government, which is essentially a very warmed attitude towards the referendum, which of course we know masks a policy of much deeper interest in revenue. I mean, we're talking billions of dollars. So regionally, I mean, I'm not sure exactly how Sudan plays in, except that China has a very strong localized presence there and have been really extracting a lot of the money that this oil-rich country has to offer. So I think that's their number one priority and their number one goal, is to see a continuation of that.
Recently Washington signaled that it is open to removing Sudan from the list of state-sponsored terrorist groups, nations. Is this important, and does it help the North or the South or both?
Well, I mean, I think it's a very strange decision given the fact that the people who probably should have been consulted in that decision, the victims of the violence that has been going on for the last 2, 3, even more decades, have not been consulted at all. And erasing that record of state-sponsored terrorism in the eyes of the international community is, I think a lot of people would say, a really big mistake.
Who have been victimized? I was thinking that it was international victims, but from what I gather, you're saying there are people inside Sudan who have been victimized as well.
Right. Well, I mean, particularly in the Abyei region, where the nomadic tribes and communities, and especially women, have been exposed to the amount of violence that has come from Khartoum back to Messeria. For example, that would be one population that should definitely have their voices heard in a decision about whether or not that's going to be struck from the record, which definitely hasn't happened.
Well, last question. Tell us a little bit more about Al-Safir. He's the South Sudan's leader. What do we know about him? Is he pro-Western? Is he, tell us a little bit more.
Well, again, I mean, with this Southern Sudanese government that's coming into power, you've seen very much the party line has been conciliatory between both the US and China, as well as with the international community. And any government that comes up in South Sudan is not going to have come independently entirely from the grassroots. It has been manipulated through puppet strings from outside of the country. And so I believe it's the same thing. I mean, this is just a politician who's been put in place as the face of this new region, which definitely needs to happen. I mean, 99% of the population has voted for it. But I don't think you're going to be seeing a good enough reflection of the majority of the Sudanese people in the South and their interests and the interests of the indigenous communities there, because so much of this is being handled from the outside.
Kanya D'Almeida, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
When we come back, Venezuela criticized for what is being called a progressive deterioration of press freedoms in the country. And finally from us tonight, Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez's turbulent relationship with the country's press has been well documented. Things got so bad at one point over the last 6 years that he challenged the owners of one station to a duel.
Things worsened recently when Chavez's administration cracked down on RCTV Internacional and 5 other cable and satellite TV stations after they failed to broadcast one of the president's speeches.
What's more alarming is new legislation that expands existing broadcast limitations to the internet. We hear more about these growing tensions in the South American country from Carlos Lauría of the Committee to Protect Journalists.
Nadie tiene el derecho de estar lanzando todos los días veneno y más veneno a la mente de los venezolanos a través de la manipulación de algunos medios de comunicación social. Nadie tiene el derecho de hacerlo.
The Venezuelan government has engaged in a systematic campaign of intimidation against voices that oppose its views in an attempt to stifle dissent. In May of 2007, the government decided not to renew the license of the oldest network, RCTV, which was an open critic of the government, the most critical network that had been on the air for more than 50 years, creating obviously a lot of damage to freedom of expression, and it was a blow to democracy. After that, in 2009, the government followed in its strategy toward stifling dissent by shutting down dozens of radio stations, most of them critical of the government, using arguments, pretexts, not to renew the licenses. And now the main enemy of the government has become the only critical broadcaster remaining in Venezuela, which is Globovisión. Globovisión is now facing a series of investigative administrative procedures that could end with the government revoking its license.
Recordar que ustedes lo que tienen es una concesión que yo pudiera en cualquier momento revocarla.
Chavez has been saying lately that the internet cannot be an outlet where people can say what they want. So now the same restrictions that applied to radio and TV can now apply to the internet. Journalists are, have to watch out because they can be investigated. That is something that creates and promotes climate that fosters self-censorship.
That's our show this week. Thanks for staying tuned.
We hope you'll join us again next time.
Till then, be independent-minded.